Hey everyone, been a few weeks since I've done one of these. Been a bit of a slacker on the uploads lately. Apologies for that. This one took a bit of work, to say the least. That was the great Al Di Meola with Race with the Devil on a Spanish Highway, coming in as my number 44, I think, greatest underrated, underappreciated, and or unknown guitar solo. I would be hard pressed to call this underrated, but considering that Al Di Meola is hardly a household name these days, I'll drop this one firmly in the underappreciated and maybe slightly unknown solos. Also considering that it showed up nowhere on Guitar World Magazine's Top 100 Solos of all time, I guess there actually is an argument to be made to call it underrated as well. Now, as with any solo that I cover that is part of a larger instrumental, I tend to cover the whole thing, as I usually do and as I did this time. This one is somewhat personal for me, and I'm going to talk about that for a bit. And in truth, I really should have this one much higher, but here we are. It's learned, practiced, and ready to go. Just maybe I should change the descriptor of this series to the greatest underappreciated solos of all time and drop the countdown aspect of it, but we'll see. Of the 150 or so solos that I've covered over the past 3 years or so, I don't recall ever dedicating anything to anyone, but I'm going to this time. I want to dedicate this one to the guy who introduced me to this amazing guitar player when I was just 13 years old, and the same guy who taught me how to play guitar, at least fundamentally, my older cousin, first cousin, Brad Drover. When I was 12 or 13 year old kid, my cousin and next door neighbor Brad, who was 6 or 7 years older than me, played guitar and had absolutely fantastic taste in music. Now, personally, before Brad expanded my musical knowledge, I was a typical kid, listening to whatever was popular on the radio and whatnot. I seem to remember being a big fan of ABBA when I was 11 or 12. Hey, I was a kid and it was 1976. Brad would take me under his wing and change all of that. He would not only introduce me to the likes of Pink Floyd, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, Supertramp, and the like, but he also introduced me to some lesser known artists who were not quite so mainstream as the aforementioned. Artists like Frank Zappa and Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, Jeff Beck, and most importantly to the discussion at hand, Al Di Meola. Al Di Meola had been around for a few years at this point, and Brad had been a fan. And in 1977, he released what would go on to be one of his career-defining albums, Elegant Gypsy. The album, in particular, that Brad introduced me to, and the one that Race with the Devil on a Spanish Highway stems from. I distinctly remember sitting around with Brad, listening to all this new to me music as a kid and being totally enthralled and blown away by all of it, but especially the guitarists, as that was very much the focus of what Brad listened to overall. Jimmy Page and David Gilmour and Frank Zappa and Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck and so on and so forth. But none blew me away more than Al Di Meola. We would just sit there and shake our collective heads at each other while listening to Al Di Meola play and that Elegant Gypsy album. How in the bloody hell can anybody play guitar that fast? Jimmy Page could certainly kick in the speed at times, albeit frantically. Jeff Beck and Frank Zappa likewise, but holy hell, this was another level altogether. I completely fell in love with this album and listened to it to death, and always dreamed of one day being good enough to play Race with the Devil on a Spanish Highway myself. Well, 46 years later, that day has finally arrived. It's been a guitar holy grail of mine for the longest time now, and I've finally tackled it. So you may ask yourself, why didn't you learn to play it when you were younger, in your 20s, if it was such an important piece of guitar music to you? Well, to be honest, as good and as fast as I thought I was back in the 80s, I simply wasn't good enough, nor was I fast enough. I tried, actually, to learn this one back in my 20s, but I simply couldn't play it back then. I'd be lying if I didn't say that I'm incredibly surprised and pleased to find myself at 56 years old playing guitar cleaner and faster than I did when I was 26. After more than a 25-year break from the guitar altogether. That's practice and determination for you. That said, it was high time to take on my old nemesis, Al Di Meola, again. And now I can finally play it. Barely. Now, when I say barely, I discovered upon finishing that the backing track that I used was ever so slightly slower than the original recording. So as a result, I'm actually playing it a touch slower than the studio recording. Regardless, I'm tapped out speed-wise as far as this one goes. I honestly can't play any faster than I played on this. It'll have to do. A few of those licks and scale runs are just so bloody fast. I don't know how many times I had to go over a few of them to get them up to speed. Hundreds, if not well over 1,000 times. Really, really difficult stuff. Anyway, enough about me. Just wanted to say thank you to Brad for getting me started on this musical journey and introducing me to such cool and interesting music when I was still a kid. And of course, for teaching me the basics on the guitar to get me started. Thank you, Brad. Look where I am now. I'm playing Al Di Meola. I haven't seen Brad in a number of years, but I'm going to track down his email and send him this video as a thank you, a long-awaited thank you, I suppose. Anyway, onwards. Al Di Meola. A Berkeley jazz guitar graduate, Al, still in his early 20s, would go on during the mid-70s to become a leading pioneer and progenitor of the genre of jazz fusion. Before Al Di Meola, few jazz artists thought to blend elements of rock, progressive rock, and hard rock into their jazz compositions and performances. Like I said, Al Di Meola was a pioneer in this regard, and as a result, achieved a higher level of fame in the late 70s and early 80s than his jazz guitar counterparts like John McLaughlin and Paco de Lucia and the like, because he also pulled in rock and hard rock fans into his fan base because of not only his blistering guitar playing, but also his penchants for touching upon rock and hard rock in his music. Most notably in this, arguably, his most famous piece, Race with the Devil on a Spanish Highway, one of two Al Di Meola instrumentals that would go on to become somewhat signature pieces of his, along with Mediterranean Sundance with Paco de Lucia, which both stemmed from his Elegant Gypsy album. Now, when I talk about Al Di Meola's speed, back in 1977, it's not a stretch to say that practically no one but Al Di Meola was playing with this type of velocity on the fretboard. And he alternate picked practically everything he did. Just an amazing right-hand technique. Sure, a few guitarists before him played fast, but not this fast. This was altogether something different and new. The only other guitar player at the time who even approached the speeds of Al Di Meola was German guitarist Uli John Roth. But Uli was hardly a household name. A few lesser-known albums with German rock band The Scorpions under his belt, while they were still only finding fame in their home country of Germany and a few other European countries. He would soon leave the Scorpions to forge his own path as a solo artist, producing music that very few people actually wanted to listen to. Thus, his tremendous guitar skills went somewhat unnoticed in the grander scheme of things. Even in 1978, when Eddie Van Halen came along and turned the whole world of guitar on its head, he still wasn't playing with the velocity of Aldi Meola. I mean, Eddie was fast, no doubt, but not this fast. His skill set certainly included speed, but the majority of his guitar talents laid elsewhere. It wasn't until the mid-'80s when a young guitar slinger out of Sweden by the name of Yngwie Malmsteen came along and finally matched and I suppose even surpassed the fleet fingers of Aldi Meola. Di Meola would go on to be a major inspiration to any number of blazingly fast guitar players that would eventually emerge as the whole shred boom occurred during the 80s. Malmsteen himself being one. Steve Vai, Vinnie Moore, Paul Gilbert, Jason Becker, John Petrucci for sure, amongst many others. Once the term guitar shredding was firmly entrenched in the guitar vernacular as the 80s grew to a close, Di Meola's music and playing took on its own term, proto-shred, a term that I find fitting, I suppose, but one that Aldi Meola himself hates. Now, Aldi Meola is a bit of an opinionated and outspoken fellow when it comes to music, and he feels that despite his speed, he was doing a whole lot more than just what one might consider shredding. He was playing jazz. That's what he was trained in school to be, a jazz guitarist, albeit he was playing it very, very fast, and sometimes to a rock beat, thus jazz fusion. Jazz guitar, strictly within the confines of the genre of jazz music, can be played extremely fast. John McLaughlin, George Benson, Tal Farlow, Joe Pass, and numerous others all played blindingly fast at times, and no one would accuse them of mindlessly playing fast with the sole goal of breaking all guitar speed limits like it's some sort of competition. They were simply, or not so simply, playing jazz. Like I said, there was nothing mindless about what Aldi Meola was doing on the guitar, something that he considered a lot of shredders of the 80s to be, mindlessly constructing solos just to go as fast as possible. Very little musicality to their solos. These were complex jazz constructions that Aldi Meola was composing and playing. And alongside that, he was also a very accomplished acoustic and flamenco player, an aspect of his playing that he was very, very good at and very proud of. So he tended to take offense to being simply called a shredder. I can also buy that argument, I suppose. Now, regardless, during the latter years of the 70s and into the 80s, the skills of Aldi Meola were matched by very few other guitar players, at least any other high-profile guitar players. Over the course of a 5 or 6 year period, at his peak, he would win a record 11 Best Jazz and or Rock Guitar Player polls in Guitar Player magazine, the preeminent guitar magazine at the time. A record unmatched before or since, even by Eddie Van Halen. A simply remarkable guitar player, even if speed is not your thing. It's not all blisteringly fast. Some of it is just beautifully constructed and played rock, flamenco-tinged jazz guitar. Without doubt, one of my favorite players of all time, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to play his masterpiece, Race with the Devil on a Spanish Highway, almost at speed, like I said. Now, I'm not going to dig too much into the nuts and bolts of this piece itself at this point, because I'm going to do a tutorial walkthrough of this one because it's still fresh in my head and there doesn't seem to be one available on YouTube. So I am going to get on that and make one. So for you fleet-fingered players out there looking for a really good challenge, keep an eye out for it. I should have it up in maybe a week or so. And that is all I've got to say about Aldi Meola tonight. I hope you enjoyed that. I sure as hell did. My 10, 12, almost 2 weeks with it. Hope you're well in your little guitar corner of the world. And we'll see you next time. Cheers.